Hello, friends. We begin our exploration of one of the most remarkable yet often forgotten branches of early Christianity, the Church of the East. Now, when we think about Eastern churches, most people immediately turn their thoughts, their minds towards the Eastern Orthodox traditions that are centered around Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. But there was another church even further east, a church that arose beyond the frontiers of the Roman Empire and the Persian world. This church, known as the Church of the East, became a vast missionary minded church at its height stretched from Mesopotamia all the way into China, India, and even Mongolia. Some historians, such as Philip Jenkins, estimate that nearly one-third of all Christians in the world at one point belonged to the church. It is an extraordinary story, and one that has been very much so neglected for centuries. Now, as I had mentioned, it had developed beyond the Roman Empire, the Church of the East, within the Persian realm. It was once again home to a great deal of the world's Christians, stretching from Babylon to China, into Yemen, into modern day Qatar, Dubai, you name it, it was there in the East, all the way into modern day Kiev. And so, despite its very vast influence, it was very much so long neglected in historical scholarship. And there's a few reasons as to why that is. Now, real quick, here you see a map of the traditional Roman Empire, probably at its height in the second century or so. And so this is the traditionally where the traditional churches had started that we think of today. When we think of the Church of the East, we think of everything from Greece and east of that into Asia and Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, into Syria, into Judea, into Egypt. Those would be considered the Eastern churches, and the West being everything centered in Rome, in Hispania, in Gallic territory, and Britannia. Those places would have been considered Western church, right? But we have to remember that beyond the eastern borders of the Roman Empire, there lay the Persian Empire, which at that time, this time during the second century, was ruled over by a group known as the Parthians. This is not the best map to showcase it, but I want us to get a visual. The Byzantine Empire really came about after the creation of Constantinople, with the breaking down of the western half of the Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire continued on until the 15th century. But I want you to get a rough idea as to what these borders looked like between Persia and Rome, and these constantly fluctuating borders based on military campaigns, negotiations, treaties, things of that nature. But roughly, this is where the borders of the Byzantine and the Persian Empire had begun. As you can see, again, they're two global superpowers that are constantly fighting and vying for territory and influence in the region, so there's going to be a lot of wars between them. Now, for a very long time, Western scholarship knew almost nothing about the Church of the East. Sebastian Brock, a leading Syriac scholar, has pointed out three major reasons for this narrow view of church history. Why it is that for so long the Church of the East has been ignored and dismissed and barely ever studied or mentioned in Western scholarship. First, he mentions the great early historian Eusebius of Caesarea, writing his ecclesiastical history around the year 300 or so. He focuses entirely, almost entirely, only on the Roman world, and says practically nothing about the Christians who live beyond the Roman frontier, in Persia or in Central Asia. And because Eusebius's work becomes the model and the framework for all later church histories, that silence continues for more than a millennium. Second, after the 5th century Christological controversies, which were covered in great detail by Dr. Fastigi in earlier lectures, the debates around the natures of Christ, the Syriac-speaking churches became very much so marginalized. The Westerners had begun to label the West Syrians and dismissed them as nothing more than Monophysites, and the East Syrians as Nestorians or Diophysites. And once it is that you're branded a heretic, you effectively disappear from the mainstream histories. Third, European scholars rarely learn Syriac. Simply put, if you don't know Syriac, you can't study anything related to Syriac. You're not able to study the Church of the East unless you understand and know the language of the Church of the East. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, the very language which Jesus spoke, but again, because it was so little known in the West and so rarely studied, these communities were largely invisible to European historians and theologians. Now, according to the ancient tradition of the Church of the East, it was the Apostle Thomas who first evangelized the lands east of the Roman Empire. And on his journey to India, Thomas is said to have sent two of his disciples, Ede and Mari, to preach the gospel in Mesopotamia. Now, some modern historians are going to dismiss this as mere fabrication, a legend, as something as an invention of the of later scholars. But recent archaeological evidence has suggested that there might be truth indeed behind the story. There are excavations in southern India that have uncovered ancient Jewish synagogues dating back to the first centuries AD, confirming that Jewish communities, often the first audience of Christian preaching, if you remember the gospel first, Jesus says, is meant for the Jews, the lost children of Israel, and then later on, after the Jews have been evangelized, then it goes on to the Gentiles. It shows that those communities had already existed along the Silk Road and had been well established by the time of Jesus. And so, Christianity in Persia probably spread first through these Jewish populations and through merchants traveling the trade routes that linked Antioch, Edessa, and Babylon with India. Now, when the Sasanian Empire deported Christian prisoners of war for Roman territory, they unintentionally accelerated the growth of the church. So first it happens through the spread of Christianity first happens through these Jewish populations and through merchants again traveling these trade routes, such as the Royal Persian Road, which we'll get to in a later slide, the Silk Road. But later on, as the Persians begin to make advancements, the Sasanian Empire in particular begins to make advancements into Roman territory. They begin to capture Romans and they begin to deport them deep within Persian territory. And this unintentionally accelerates the growth of the church. It plants Christians deep within the empire. Now, very interestingly, the Persian rulers initially under the Parthian Empire, this was the empire that was established before the Sasanians, were initially very tolerant of Christianity. It was only in the mid-4th century, when Rome itself became officially Christian, that Persian kings began to grow very suspicious of Christians in their empire. Suddenly it looked like the Christians might become potential allies of Rome, their empire's greatest enemy, and so only naturally would they persecute them. We'll talk about that in the next lecture. Now, before we move on in our study, we have to understand how it is that Christianity in this region spread so quickly and how it gained such a foothold with remarkable speed. Between the Roman and the Persian empires lay this region known as Mesopotamia, home to a people who called themselves Syriac-speaking Christians, such as today the Syrians, the Chaldeans, the Syrians, and they all spoke, again, this common language of Syriac, this dialect of Aramaic. And because everyone shared this language and culture, having this common tongue, this lingua franca, Christianity spread with remarkable speed. Unlike the West, where the gospel had to be translated into Latin or Greek or Coptic, here in this region it moved very quickly in the natural tongue of the people. The Persian Empire also offered something very critical and something crucial to the remarkable growth of Christianity in the region: safety and mobility. For example, the imperial royal road, stretching from Edessa to the Persian Gulf, allowed missionaries and merchants to travel very widely and very safely. It's the first Christian communities in Persia rose along this route in places like Adabain, Babylonia, and Elam. From there, the faith spread to Fars, Arabia, and even to India and China. By the year 225, we already find evidence of Christian communities not only in Mesopotamia, but also in Media, Fars, Gilan on the Caspian Sea, and even near the Hindu Kush Mountains. Now, the Church of the East has already, at this just in the 3rd century, has already become a trans-Asian church before the Roman Empire had even begun to consider to legalize Christianity. In fact, during this same period, it's being heavily persecuted. Again, here we see the Royal Road, the Persian Royal Road, which, again, Christianity, we are told, had sprung along this route as it provided a lot of mobility and safety. Roads were critical to trade, and so they would be very, very protected from bandits and from armies and all those other things. And mobility along that road, because they were paved, and even it would be very easy to traverse along that road at a remarkable speed. So a lot of the early Christian communities took part in this road. It has a lot of kind of roads that jet off from it, and so they would be able to use those roads as well. But this was the main Persian Royal Road that allowed for Christianity to spread so significantly, so quickly throughout the region. Later on, we'll see how it is that the missionaries took the Silk Road that went into China, named the Silk Road because it is that it carried silk, a very important commodity that China and only China could provide at that time. That was brought into the Western world from China. So Christianity also spread along those routes in the early centuries as well. But we'll talk about that later on. Now, the Church of the East preserved a number of beautiful, beautiful foundation legends. They're not just pious tales, and whether you believe them to be true or not, whatever it might be, they reveal how the church understood itself. One of the most beautiful of these stories is called the Doctrine of Edde, and it tells us how it is that St. Thomas's disciple, Mar Edde, converted King Abgar V of a little small buffer kingdom between Persia and Rome, sometimes a client state of Rome, sometimes a client state of Persia, depending upon the time period that we're talking, and who exerted more control over the small kingdom known as Azrehon. Edde's companion, Marmari, carried the gospel farther south into Babylonia and to Seleucia Ctesiphon, the capital of the Persian Empire. Now, the most famous of these stories is found in the Acts of Thomas. It tells us how it is that the Apostle Thomas traveled to India, where it is that he served at the court of a certain King Gundafar. Now, for centuries, this story was just dismissed as a legend and nothing more. No one really paid much attention to this, and scholars just kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, what a nice story, it's just a legend. But until very recently, archaeology has discovered coins and inscriptions bearing his name, dated precisely to the 1st century, around the time of Thomas. Now, that discovery dramatically changes our understanding. It made the story of Thomas far more plausible. Combine that with early Christian communities that are found in India, it suggests that there really was an apostolic mission reaching that far east. Now, church fathers such as Ephraim the Syrian also testify to this, and interestingly, Ephraim and other Syriac sources never claimed Thomas for their own church in Persia. Think about that. Instead, they insist that Thomas went to India while Mar Edde evangelized Mesopotamia. Now, that humility, that willingness to give Thomas to India rather than to claim him, actually lends the story far greater credibility. Now, when we piece all of this together, the geography, the trade networks, and the new archaeological evidence, it's entirely possible that Thomas's mission encompassed both Persia and India, forming a single Eastern Christian world that is linked by this faith. Just to give you a little bit of context, so you have, we're talking about the kingdom of Azrehon, just to give you a little visual as to where it is. Here is Azrehon, and here is now the Parthian Empire we see, or the Persian Empire. We'll get to why it's called the Parthian versus the Sasanian in a later lecture. But the Parthian Empire here, and here over to the west is going to be the Roman Empire. And again, so Azrehon, you can see, is just smack dab in the middle. It's going to be a client kingdom, a buffer state sometimes more under the influence of the Persians, sometimes more under the influence of the Romans, just depending on the time period and the events that were happening at the time, and who had more strength and more influence at the time. But this map is just to serve as a very important depiction of what it is that we're talking about, right? It gives you an image as to what it is that we're talking about. Edessa is going to be a very important city to study in the Church of the East, and will come up in our later lectures as well, as having a very prominent school of theology that trained the Persian clergy for a number of years before it is that it was closed. And later on, we'll see that's when the school of Nisibis comes into play. As we wrap up our lecture, I want us to consider some final thoughts. Why does all of this matter? First, we have to remember that the Church of the East is rooted in apostolic origins. It's the confidence and the knowledge that the faith of the Church of the East comes directly from the apostles, not from Rome or Constantinople, but from the apostles, from the St. Thomas himself and his disciples. Second, they expressed a very deeply rooted Semitic Christianity, shaped by the language and the worldview of the Bible itself, not by Greek philosophy. This meant that theology developed along different lines, more biblical, more poetic, and more Semitic in expression. This is going to lead to further discussion. This I'm going to keep in mind for our further lectures. Third, these traditions inspired an expansive missionary vision. The Church of the East did not see itself as a very small sect on the edge of the empire, but as a world church, called to carry the gospel to every nation from Mesopotamia to the Pacific. It was, in many ways, the first truly global church. Now, the Church of the East began in the Persian Empire, rooted in the Syriac culture of Mesopotamia. Its founders traced their lineage to the Apostle Thomas and his disciples at Deir Mari. It flourished along the great trade routes, becoming a church that spanned continents. Although Western historians had long ignored it because of geography, theology, and language, modern research, as we have talked about, has discovered and rediscovered its importance. In our next lecture, we're going to see how it is that this church organizes itself, endured waves and waves of persecution, and eventually emerged as this church that would carry the faith very deep into Asia.